Well, welcome everyone to today's BC Support Unit webinar, which will be about an hour in length. My name is Pat Atherton, and I'm responsible for training and capacity development at the BC Support Unit. Our webinar today is Exploring Subjectivity, an Introduction to Q Methodology, presented by Rachel Baker, who is Professor of Health Economics and Director of the UNU Centre of Social Business and Health at Glasgow Caledonian University. I probably butchered that centre's name. I would like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations from whose traditional lands we are leading this meeting today. I thank our hosts with humility. You may have noticed that we've muted you as we joined the webinar to avoid background noise during the presentation. So we encourage you to use the chat box to share questions for discussion at the end of Rachel's presentation. The chat box can be found in the top right area of your screen or the bottom area, depending on what your user interface looks like. At the end of the presentation, your microphone will be unmuted, so you can ask your question using your microphone or via the chat, whichever you prefer. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, which is bcsupportunit.ca, under Resources, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And now, without further ado, over to you, Rachel. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to Sterling. I'm delighted to be at the BC Support Unit and to talk a little bit about Q methodology, which is an approach which I have enjoyed using since my PhD, which is about 15 years ago, and I haven't grown tired of it. So hopefully it'll be of interest to you. I've used the word subjectivity in the title of the presentation, partly because it's a word that Q methodologists have always used since the originator of Q, exploring subjectivity as a way of getting into people's views and values and beliefs and opinions. And I feel like for a support unit that's interested in patients' voices and listening to people's experiences and reactions, that hopefully it will be of interest to your community too. And I'll move on the slide by...
Maybe just use the arrow.
Good, okay. So I'll start with kind of where Q came from and what we can use it for, and I'll get into some of the basic mechanics. Thinking simply about inputs and outputs, really, what goes in a Q study in terms of data, what we do and what comes out of the other end in simple terms. So I won't be talking about the mathematics of factor analysis, which might disappoint some, but mostly I think that'll be a relief. But I'll think more conceptually about the analysis and what we uncover using Q techniques. And then I'll talk a little bit about when and why you might want to use it. And hopefully throughout you'll get a sense of this being a mixed method approach where we are using qualitative techniques and quantitative techniques in combination throughout the research process, which is something that excites me about it. Before we get on then, I just wanted to say something about the Q logo that came around, some of you in the blurb that I sent around. So this is the Q that we used for the 2017 annual International Q Methodology Conference, which we hosted at Glasgow Caledonian. And we designed a logo which was based on a very recognisable site in Glasgow, which is this. This is the Duke of Wellington monument outside Glasgow's Modern Art Gallery. And Glaswegians like to decorate him with a traffic cone. So it's very well known. It's always there, and every so often they take it down, and then people climb up and put more on. So sometimes the horse gets one too. And at times the council has said, well, we'll raise the plinth so you can no longer climb on top of the monument and decorate it with a traffic cone, and that's met with huge public opposition, and then they back down and we carry on. So that's kind of a sense of Glaswegians and how they, the sense of humour, I suppose, and how we represent ourselves, and that entered into our Q logo. So to crack on with the main meat of where we're going and where this all started from. Q methodology is not new. William Stephenson first wrote about using factor analysis in a different way in a letter to the journal Nature in 1935. And his seminal book is 1953. He's quite an interesting character. He was a physicist to begin with, so he came out of quite a positivist tradition. He did a second PhD in psychology and ended up working in Oxford with Charles Spearman, who had a lab that was doing lots around developing factor analysis at that time. And William Stephenson wanted to use factor analysis in a different way to look at what he called the science of subjectivity. So to use mathematical tools to look at something that actually is quite qualitative and complex. So when he writes about subjectivity, he's talking about anything that touches on views, opinions, beliefs, values, and tastes. And that's the sorts of things that we can use Q methods to investigate in research. There we go. One of the doctoral students of William Stephenson is Professor Steve Brown, who's at Kent State University, and he has written lots about Q methodology. This is his main book, which was published in 1980, but the quote comes from a different paper. And I really like this quote as a way of summing up Q and what Q is good for. So he says, although it's only about subjective opinions, which are typically not provable, we can show that they have structure and form. And what Q allows us to do is to identify those structures and look at them. So to study that form, those structures, and try and interpret those patterns and shapes in the data. So I think that's a good kind of starting point for Q methodology and what I think it does. So I'm just going to talk through what goes in, what we do, and what comes out in a Q study. In terms of what goes in, the very basic data that we collect in a Q study is a rank ordering of items, usually statements of opinion. And then we're looking for patterns between people's rank orderings of those same items, and we look to then interpret what those patterns mean and generate rich descriptions of the kinds of shared views that exist on whatever subject we are interested in. And what I'll come to later on is that I think one of the strengths of Q methodology is that once we have developed those rich descriptions, we can also say some more about what it is that separates people. So what distinguishes those points of view, what pulls people apart and makes that a different perspective on the world. But also between competing points of view, in the face of disagreement, where we can identify moments of consensus, which can be helpful, particularly for policy development and so on. Okay, so let's start with what goes in and what that rank ordering of those statements looks like. Here's a Q grid. So we don't present people with statements and ask them to line them up from 1 to 50, say, and you can have 40 or 50 or 60 statements in a Q study. That would be quite a challenging task, I think. We help respondents through that by using a grid that looks something like this. So there's a few things to say about the grid as you look at it. One is that it's sort of quasi-normal or bell-shaped, and so we're allowing at the right-hand side fewer statements to be placed in positions which represent people's strongly held opinions. So in this grid, it's marked most agree at the right, and we've got 3, 4, and 5 statements placed in those columns would be those ones that we felt very strongly and positively about, and most disagree at the left, and that would be the reverse. So we're allowing few things that we care passionately about, and as we get towards the middle of the grid, will be statements that don't resonate so much, that we don't care about so much, that maybe we feel more ambivalent, or they lack meaning for us. So suppose there's around 50 statements, and those are represented on this picture by those little yellow cards, numbered cards with statements of opinion on them. The first thing we do is ask people to read through them and put them into 3 basic piles quite quickly: broadly agree, broadly disagree, or feel neutral about them. And from those 3 piles, then we would ask a participant to take the statements that you agree with and pick out, in this case, the 2 that you most agree with, and place those under the number 5. And then the 3 from the remaining cards that you agree with, that you next most agree with, and place those under the number 4 on the grid. until you kind of run out of cards and the whole grid has been filled. Within a column, so those columns 5 and 4, we have tied ranks. So the 2 statements under 5 are considered most degree statements, but we're not distinguishing between those 2, and the same for the column under 4. So we've got a kind of a ranking that has ties in it, and that's the basic data that we're collecting. We will also talk to people, though, about what they're doing, and when they've completed the Q sorting process, which will start from those outside ends. So we'll start from the statements that we really care passionately about. They'll be placed first and work towards the middle of the grid. And when it's all done, we'll likely have a conversation with them. So if we're doing face-to-face Q sorting, you can get quite a lot of interesting information that will help in the interpretation stages and in the analysis by just asking a participant to sum up their views. So now you've sorted all the cards, how would you just sum up what you think or feel about this topic? Tell me why those cards at the top were the ones that you most agree with. What didn't you like about the ones at the bottom? And that can be quite illuminating, particularly if it's a perspective that I'm not that familiar with as an analyst. So we can come back to the Q sorting, but you're probably thinking, where do the statements come from and who is doing the Q sorting? So a little bit on each of those. In Q terminology, we talk about concourse. That comes from William Stephenson's language. And concourse is really used to capture that on any subject, that we might have opinions about, there will be a kind of a messy, noisy conversation that you can listen to about that. And people will agree and disagree with each other. And as they agree, there's a kind of flocking together, if you like. So concourse is meant to say that the flocking together of people or ideas or opinions. So if you think that around a topic which might have lots of current discussion, so in the UK you can think of Brexit or Boris Johnson if you want to, maybe not, then there'll be lots and lots of discussions going on in formal and informal settings, online, in newspapers, around dinner tables, in pubs and so on. And if we imagine that's a kind of a messy noise, and what we're trying to do is extract the key ideas that are different and don't overlap. In developing a Q set, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to sample from the concourse a representative set of statements that sums up everything, if you like, that can be said on the topic. And we can gather our statements from a whole range of sources. It's really about where would you listen to those conversations? And that will depend on the research question that you are interested in. So we've used interviews where you're actually sort of constructing the concourse. You're asking people to say things for you in response to questions that you're asking. Or we can go to existing sources like publications, documents, policy documents, newspapers. We've actually used the readers' comments that follow newspaper articles to try and get a window into kind of public opinion. I don't recommend that always. I think that shows you the extremes of humanity, but it'll give you some sense of what is being shared. Social media public consultations, for example. So we're looking to listen to the conversations and to get all views on the subject if you can. So not, if you're looking at newspapers, not only to look at left-wing broadsheet newspapers, but also to pick up right-wing tabloids, for example. In a UK context, you'll get different ideas and different statements from those sources. And in the first instance, you really are looking for quantity over quality. So it's a bit like saying, what is being said, and grabbing every statement that is a statement of opinion on that topic and kind of dropping it into a tray to go back to and then sift through. So you'll start with maybe 200 or 300 statements probably. But then what we'll find is that there are overlaps, that there's duplicates within that set. And what you're trying to do is then the researcher will try and whittle that down into a sort of manageable number, which becomes the Q set. And in doing that, we are looking for 2 things. Coverage of the issues. So there's nothing really missing from this that people are saying that's important. And balance. And balance is is a little bit more tricky, but it relates to achieving a Q set that people who are our participants who sort the Q set can express themselves through and will not, for instance, agree with everything. So there needs to be some balance so that we can comfortably say, I agree with these statements and I disagree with those statements. And that ought to be true for people, for example, who are very pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit people. So you need to think through whether or not the balance is there for all kinds of respondents. And it's worth saying, I think, that in any Q study, this is the slow bit. It's very kind of systematic. It feels like a kind of, a bit like reviewing the literature. You're not trying to synthesize, but you are trying to get at everything that's there. Everything that happens after you've settled on a Q set then feels kind of fast and exciting and like a voyage of discovery. But we need to know that that set of statements is right before we take off. We would usually pilot it, usually try and get some people who are going to think differently on the issue and ask them to say what's missing. Did they feel okay about sorting it? So that is the Q set. There's no real rules about how many statements, but if you look at the literature, certainly the more modern literature, I'd say 30 to 50, 40 to 60 statements. Some older Q studies, I think, were bigger. The main thing is that you're representing the topic of interest, so it will depend on the research question. And participant engagement is an issue. I mean, a Q sort might take somebody 40 or 50 minutes of that size, but the bigger the Q set, the longer the sorting will take. Okay. Here's some example statements from a set that we designed for a study that was concerned with societal views on life extension at the end of life. So the research question was around where, for example, expensive medicines might be made available for people who have a diagnosis of a terminal illness, but might extend life by some months, and whether or not that extra health gain at the end of life was worth more than other types of health gain that we might have in the system. So some examples of statements, you can see that there's shorter ones, like we all have the right to life, and longer ones, real help and compassion is about providing a death with dignity, and so on. They tend to be conversational. They tend to be naturalistic in the words of people who might say them. So we're not trying to clean them up too much. It's perfectly okay in Q studies for different people to interpret the same statement in different ways. And that's very different, if you like, than if we were designing a questionnaire study where the ambition is that everybody reads the questions in exactly the same way and interprets them in the same way. In Q studies, people with different perspectives placing different interpretations actually can be extremely illuminating in an analysis. So it's okay. You don't want complete misunderstandings, but it's okay for people to see things in different ways in the Q set. This is a very different type of item that you might use in a Q study. This comes from Helen Mason's PhD study in health economics. And her Q items were much more structured. As you can see, they describe treatments that might be prioritized, for example, a local health authority to invest in. And every card had that same format. So there was different treatments, but we told them whether or not it improved quality of life and life expectancy and so on. So that's a very structured statement. Here's one without words altogether. So this has been designed for children around food choice. And so they're actually giving people, a tin of beans and a packet of Cocoa Pops and asking the children to say most favorite to least favorite. And this is an example of a Q set of items that are photographs around rivers and wetlands in New Zealand. I think this study was of. So just to give you a sense of the kind of non-word-based, non-statement-based Q sets. Obviously, it depends again on your research question whether or not this is an appropriate thing to do, and it would I think introduce challenges of interpretation depending on the Q items that you present people with when it comes to the analysis. but it can be quite creative. Okay, so then suppose we've got a set of statements that we're happy with, that has coverage and that has balance. Who would we ask to do our Q sorting for us? And here the sampling is very much like qualitative methods in the sense that we would approach a group of people who are likely to have a perspective on the subject that we're interested in, who are likely to have different points of view, who are likely to have strongly held views. And the aim is to be not representative of a population, but purposive in our sampling. So we are looking to identify the nature of people's subjectivities. It's about what are those subjectivities? What do people think on this topic? Not how many people think this about this topic, but what is it? What's the nature of it? And so that's why the sampling of Q studies tends to be relatively small, 40 to 60 respondents, and I think draws on some ideas of data saturation in a way. So if we are looking to identify the points of view that exist around a topic, which is really what Q studies do, then once we've identified a point of view and there are people who are helping us to understand it, so they're associated with that point of view, additional people contributing to it give us little in terms of new information, except to say I'm also perspective 1 or perspective 2. So the data saturation idea from qualitative methods, I think, also can be applied to Q sampling. When we did our study of life extension at the end of life, to give you an example of how we've selected participants, we talked to people who, as you can imagine, had written about that in the academic literature, economists, ethicists, people who were practitioners, so people working in palliative care, cancer nurses and doctors, and policymakers. But we also talked to people who had experience of cancer, who had been bereaved, and to people with different religious beliefs. So we had a notion that, well, maybe your view of the afterlife has some impact on how you view the value of life at the end of life, for example. So it not just the professions, but what might give somebody a different kind of perspective on this issue. And we talked to journalists and thought leaders and so on. So it's quite a mixed group. As you'd expect, you can do that data collection, that Q sort in a number of different ways. I'd advise one-to-one, face-to-face if you can possibly, because of that conversation you can have around the Q sort and how much that helps. You can get people together in groups too. In that context, you would still be asking them to complete individual Q sorts usually. It's unusual to want a kind of groupthink Q sort, but you might have group discussion afterwards. I would caution that if you can't link people's comments to their Q sorts, that might be less helpful than the one-to-ones. But it can be quick to get people together in groups. It can be practically the best approach. And you can do it online, and you can even do it by post. Skype people and have them open the envelope and talk them through what to do. So whatever's practical, depending on location and so on. Okay, so we've got the Q set of statements. We know what a Q sort basically looks like. We know who we would ask to do some Q sorting for us, depending on our subject. What do we then do with the information that we get as analysts or researchers? And what we're doing is, as in that Steve Brown quote at the start, is we're looking for patterns and structures in the data. And then when we see those patterns, can we interpret those? So I'm going to talk through the kinds of information that come out of a factor analysis and a little bit on interpretation, just to give you a flavour. Factor analysis is a data reduction method. People might be familiar with it in other contexts. It's basically about taking a large number of variables and trying to find underlying dimensions that help us to explain patterns in the data. There's hardly ever only one possible solution, so there's some judgment that comes into selecting a factor solution. And the Q sorters are treated as variables, and I'll show you what we mean by that the factors that come out of a Q study are really clusters of Q sorts that are similar. And there's software available that does a lot of this for you. You don't have to get too far under the bonnet of the car if you don't want to. PQ method is the one that I use, but as you can see, it looks a bit scary. It's very DOS-based. It works perfectly well, and you can become fond of it. But there are other Windows-based software available now too. Whatever software you use, the first thing that you'll do, and the first thing that the software will do for you, is to calculate a correlation matrix. And all this is so if we assume that everybody around this table or everybody involved in this webinar had completed a Q sort for me, the correlation matrix is telling me pair by pair how similar the way that you've ranked the cards is to everybody else in the room. So Q sorter 1 on the first row there is very similar in their perspective to Q sorter 2, because the correlation coefficient there is 0.85, which is close to 1. I should have said, so the correlation coefficient will run from -1 to 1, with 1 being an absolutely identical Q sort between a pair of people, -1 being a complete flip. So if all those statements I agreed with, you disagreed with in an absolute mirror image, then we'd have a negative correlation. And there's nothing in common really. So Q sorter 1 is similar to Q sorters 2, 3, and 4 there, but has very little in common with Q sorter 11, for example. Sometimes that can be helpful just to look at that relatively raw data, because if you completed the Q sorts with individuals in person, you will have some idea of what you think they think and feel. And so the correlation matrix can support that, but sometimes it can surprise you. And two people that you think are talking in a similar way are presenting you with not very well correlated Q sorts, and it's an indication that you need to think a bit harder about what they were saying. So it can be useful to glance at the correlation matrix, but it's just the first step in the factor analysis, which then seeks to, using those correlations, find clusters of similar Q sorts. So in this picture, the similarity is represented by colours. The reddish Q sorts are Q sorts that are relatively highly correlated with each other, and they're not so well correlated with the greens and the blues. So the factor analysis is using that information about correlations to draw out the underlying dimensions, which here are shared perspectives, similar points of view on a topic. And our job as researchers is to interpret those here 3 different perspectives or world views. And the analysis allows us to, and the software allows us to create a composite Q sort, a kind of average ranking of the cards for people who are reddish in their views or greenish. And so it brings together people who are similar and says, well, on average, this is what they look like. And what we can do for each factor then is to lay out the cards, I mean, literally physically on the grid again, in the order that a pure factor A person would be laying out the cards. And that's the principal basis of our interpretation. So we'll be looking at, I'll come to what we'll be looking at, the sorts of cards that average Q sort has in those most agree and most disagree tails, and some other information as well as part of that interpretation. What we also will know something about is the extent to which each of us are associated with those 3 factors. So factor A, factor B, and factor C are composites of people's shared perspectives, but I'm unlikely to be absolutely 100% factor A. I may have a very strong association with factor A, but actually have something in common with B or C too. And that's called a factor loading. So this is a very sort of simple table showing you that person number 1 here is highly associated with factor 1. So you can see 0.625 there. It's a relatively high correlation, but doesn't have anything in common with factor 2. And every so often we'll have people who are sharing or mixed loaders. They don't have a pure perspective of the type that we've identified. They actually believe something of A and something of B. why this is important is that those pure loaders, or exemplars as we might call them, defining Q sorters, have talked to us, remember, about what they think about the world. And so as we try and interpret factors A, B, and C, we might look at who are the exemplars, who's really tied into that point of view, and what did they say? So we're looking at the composite Q sort, the laying out of cards for factor A, but we're also going to the interview data and saying, well, and how did they speak about that? So there's multiple inputs into our interpretation of Q factors. But the first step would be to look at the cards that they really care about, the statements they really support and the ones that they really hate, salient statements. They'll be in the poles of that composite Q sort. And you can get quite a lot of information just from that. So just to give you an example, this is a paper using Q methods, the lead author is Neil McHugh at Glasgow Caledonian, where we were looking at perspectives on health inequalities. So what do people think are the causes of and the solutions to the poorer health that we witness in low-income communities? So we did a Q study with community participants and with professionals, and I won't give all the findings of that, but just a window into those salient statements for one of the factors. So factor one of that study, looking at the two statements that people on factor one most agree with. Oh, and I should say, so these statements are slightly unusual because they are all prefixed by the same, they all start with the same prefix. So we had people looking at statements that say communities with low incomes or low-income communities have poorer health because. So that's the start of every statement. So that statement 13 here, which is amongst the strongest supported statement for people who think like factor one, would say communities with low incomes have poor health because of how the welfare system works, or because of the stress of making decisions like do we eat or do we heat. And you can see that they think health inequalities are caused by insecure jobs that don't have meaning, or that they have things are expensive for poor people, finances are unpredictable, and this is what causes poor health in the view of factor one. And these are the salient statements that appear in the most disagree columns for factor one in this study. So people in low-income communities have poorer health because people have too many children. No, totally disagree, because there's a culture of dependency and laziness. It's not that either. So people on factor one are rejecting these things and supporting the statements we just looked at. So you can get kind of a sense of what these people are thinking. And the other factors in this study are very, very different. And there is a factor that is more inclined to blame people for their dependency on the welfare system and for their laziness. So these are not the same across all factors. As well as the salient statements, we would look at distinguishing statements and consensus statements. So these are statements that are placed very differently, first of all, between factors. And in this study, for factor one, that first statement, the poorer health is because of how the benefit system works, is only important to factor one. So the numbers that follow in brackets are where that statement appeared in Q sorts for people on factor one, factor two, and factor three. So it came at 4, plus 4, which is the very rightmost column for factor one, and right in the middle, so it didn't matter to factors 2 and 3. So that's a distinguishing statement, and that can be important to interpretation. But other statements might find consensus across factors. So statement number 6 in this example, because of unpredictable finances, everybody could sort of agree with that. That was part of the cause of health inequalities. So a consensus statement like that can tell you something about where people are overlapping in their worldviews. So just to sum up then what you get out of a Q study, you get that composite Q sort for each factor. So we lay out the cards for each factor and try and interpret it. Something about how closely associated each person is, each participant is with each of your factors. How important each statement is to each factor, so what's driving the finding, if you like, and these distinguishing and consensus statements. But what we're aiming for actually are rich descriptions of the shared perspectives that exist. So the researcher is taking all of that information and interpreting it and creating a narrative. It's really about getting your head into how people see a topic or feel about a particular aspect of the world. It's not something that, although there's all this mathematical information there that just pops out, we look at qualitative and quantitative material and we try and generate these rich descriptions. And getting your head inside somebody else's head can be challenging. And so one of the things that we'll do as researchers is we'll do the same Q sort as everybody else does and put ourselves into the analysis and reflect on the factor that we are on and how that might influence how we can interpret the factor that we can see quite clearly and the factors that maybe are quite different from our own views. Okay. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour, but when might you consider using Q methodology? Why might you go and try and find out more about it? And I think if you're interested in subjective views, values, and beliefs, it's worth considering. If what you want to generate are some rich understandings, it can be useful for that. Shared meanings, things that distinguish points of view, things which find consensus. And conflict resolution might be one interesting area where mapping out the differences, but also finding those points of consensus is helpful. And if you are intrigued or excited by combining qualitative and quantitative information, which I think is hugely rewarding. More specifically, I suppose, it might be particularly useful, and I was thinking from a qualitative perspective, where we've got lots of other qualitative methods like interviews and observations and group discussions and other things, when might you not choose that or choose to supplement that with something more structured like Q methodology? And I think it can be useful if you've got a question of people that they don't have a readily articulated answer to. So they haven't rehearsed their views, but they can respond, but to drop in on them and say, in an hour, please construct an answer to this complex question verbally, that's quite a challenge, I think. So it's a nice way of presenting some of the issues to people and allowing them to give you views without having to find that sort of ready-made narrative. It's useful if you want to enumerate some aspects of your findings. So it's probably another seminar to go into this, but if you are using Q alongside other methods, so for example, for health economists, preference elicitation methods, or if you want to design a survey, the quantitative, more sort of stats aspects of Q actually can be really helpful in doing those other things or in connecting the qualitative information with other quantitative information. And I'd say from a health economist point of view, it's useful in areas where qualitative methods may not be well accepted. I think there's much more qualitative work going on in health economics now, but it probably has taken a long time to get to that level of acceptance. For me, it's really rewarding. My experience of doing Q sorts with participants is that other people find it fun. So it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle around your views, and there's something satisfying about completing a Q sort and being able to say, yep, that kind of sums up how I feel on this. It's also rewarding because, and again, thinking as a kind of qualitative analyst too, you are forced to face any surprises in your data. There's kind of no way of avoiding the fact that there's correlations that you didn't anticipate. And you can't overlook them. And so there's this idea of abduction and surprises in the data, and the analysis allows you to follow up hunches and to say, well, what's that about? Let's try a different factor solution and see what pops out there. It's always based on those correlations and they don't move, but there are different ways of looking at the data from different angles that might give you different insights. And I also like the transparency of it. So I like the fact that although we're looking at something complex and subjective, I can pass my data set to one of my colleagues and say, you know, would you mind having a go at that? What solution would you find? How would you interpret this factor and so on? So I like that kind of replicability and transparency of Q methodology. So I think we're getting close to the 45-minute point. I thought I'd leave you just with some pointers towards some resources, but I'm very happy to follow up with anybody who'd like more detail. These are the original tomes, not all in print still, but available. And these are available in more modern kind of how-to texts that are helpful, especially for a new Q methodologist. There is an international Q journal, which is just full of papers about Q, and it crosses almost any discipline you can and sort of substantive area that you can think of. So there's lots in there. And that's me. There is a Q methodology website that links to all sorts of resources and papers, which I'd encourage you to look at, and a society. But please feel free to follow up with me by email too. Thank you.
Hey, Rachel, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I feel like I understand the method far better now. And I see we're just zooming out the camera so that those who are awake can see who's actually in the room with you. So I'm going to open up the mics for everybody who's on WebEx, just so you're aware if you've got any dogs barking or background noise, now would be the time to take care of that. While I'm doing that, I'm wondering if there are any questions from within the room.
I have a question, if I can. So I guess that this issue around representation, representativeness of sample, having some sense of like, are these views widely held versus sort of like someone with fairly like extreme but marginal views? I guess, how do you ensure that you are not like just hearing from people who actually like are at the extreme end rather than actually those that are quite common sort of perspectives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A Q study as I've described it, will not tell you how commonly held or well supported the views are. What we'll find out is what views exist, including the marginal views. And I think in some cases that's again one of the strengths. You are trying to describe and understand in detail how people think, not how many people think. Having said, so your sampling of participants mustn't miss anything either. So there must be people in there who don't hold extreme, pro and anti views. There must be others in there too. But you'll get factor A, B, and C, and you might think there's quite a lot of people on A, and there's fewer people on C, but you mustn't conclude that C is not a common view. It just might be that your qualitative sampling didn't pick up more. What you can do, though, what we've done, is design a survey on the basis of those findings. So now I know there's 3 factors. What are, and this is where it's really helpful, what are the salient things that would distinguish people who have that point of view? And we'll use those as kind of markers. So in a survey, and we went online to 5,000 people, nationally representative, we didn't give them the whole Q sort, but we gave them the ones that we knew were the real hot statements that would distinguish them, and then we counted them. And we found in our end-of-life study, 2 very common and 1 much more kind of marginal view. Mm.
Thanks,
Rachel. Can I ask?
Speak up.
I was wondering, how do you do the analysis of the results? I would like to know more details. Do you have a software that helps or visual?
Yeah, there are a number of software packages that you can use. They are using the maths, if you like, of factor analysis, so which is used much more widely. So that's what's in there, if you like. That's the nuts and bolts of those software packages. But the software packages are designed not just to use the correlations and present you with possible factors, so underlying dimensions depending on the correlations, but also to generate for you, this is your composite Q sort if you choose this solution. So it's really handy, these bespoke software packages. Is that kind of what you were asking? Is that, yeah. So it's kind of, you press a button and it says, well, if you want 3 factors, this is what they would look like. It's a bit like that, but there's almost always more than one choice. So there were kind of rules of thumb about what would be a statistically stronger factor, and you would use that alongside. But is it interpretable? You know, does it coincide with what people were saying? And over time, you'd select a factor solution that was telling you something about the data. Does that help? Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. Any questions from outside of the room, those who are participating by WebEx? You can either unmute yourself. I see everybody's remuted themselves. You can either unmute yourself or use the chat box. So I have a question. I'm a WebExer, so I will pose it if that's okay, Rachel. And that is, as you know, the BC Support Unit supports researchers who are participating in patient-oriented research. So I'm wondering if you've got any experience. You talked about in your example engaging community participants, and I'm wondering if you went back to them with the results and how you were able to explain to them in lay language what it was you were doing and what your results were.
That's a good question. In that paper we didn't, but in the end of life work that I talked about, we did go back to people, and we had group sessions, you know, kind of research engagement sessions where we presented these factors and said, we think these are our findings and this is how we're interpreting them. And it's quite good fun because you can have everybody in the room do the Q sorts and then say, oh, it looks, and then quick analysis over lunchtime, and, you know, they all get an envelope and they open the envelope and say, oh, I'm a factor 3 person. I didn't, you know, that kind of thing. So that's fun and engaging. But in that study, we also made videos, kind of talking heads videos that they were put together for us by a company using actors, but in the style of kind of vox pops or something like that. So a microphone and somebody in the street saying what they think. And we summed up the factors in short descriptions, and it was as if people on the street were giving their views. There are other ways you can be creative. You can have people draw their factors, you know, so sit around and put together pictures, or so there's lots of ways, I think, of being creative about the interpretation and the presentation of the factors back to people. And sometimes it'll move your interpretation on, right? So it's a really useful part of the researchers' inputs as well, to actually be engaged in a knowledge exchange that's going 2 ways. So maybe don't finalize absolutely a factor interpretations before taking them to people. Maybe make that part of the process.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Any questions from other WebExers other than me? Hearing none, how about back to the room?
I just have one question in terms of, if you have your Q-sort and you have your definitive number, final 40, so I know you say you kind of follow up with some interview and input. Do you ask them specifically to sort of identify statements, of, if, you know, if they had 3 more Q-sorts, what would they write on them, or to identify pieces that they thought were missing? Like, what would be the process to help with that, other than an interview or something like that? I'm just trying to figure out how they would identify gaps.
Yeah, and we would make that part of a piloting process for sure. So we would go out with what we think is our key set,
Right.
and we would do some pilots, and we would pick people that we think are going to see the world differently too. So not just your office mates piloting, but people that might have different views, and ask the very question you've just indicated. So we've asked you to sum up your views. What did you want to say that you couldn't say with the set of cards that we gave you? And so then adding things in. But at some point, I think you do have to settle on a final set of cards, because the analysis depends on the fact that everybody has seen the same and is responding to the same stimuli. It wouldn't stop you from still continuing to ask that question and at least knowing that for somebody later on there was something they wanted to say that wasn't in there. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Lynn. Dr. Bryan, please.
So the sort of like normal distribution pattern that you have for for the sorting of the cards. I could imagine that, like, for some people, that's quite constraining. That, like, there's a lot of things that you might have strong views on, and there are other people who, like, sort of struggle to, like, say that they've got strong views on any of this. So, do you find that people, like, just struggle with that, or does that just come naturally that people, like, are able to sort that way?
I mean, that's absolutely a debate that goes on in the literature, and as people pick up the method, they wonder and ask that question. I think it is based in a kind of psychology that suggests that we don't bang the table about everything. There are a few things that tend to get you riled up, and then there's other things that you don't feel the same about. So it's kind of supported in that way, but we do call it a forced sort in the sense that you are asking people to choose only two. In that example, you can design the grid to fit however many statements you've got. It might not be only two at the end. And usually when I'm sort of facilitating a Q sort, if people say, well, I've got three, then I'll coax them a wee bit and say, well, which one, I mean, even marginally less important, it's still there in the column number 4, it still enters into the analysis as important. Usually people can make a fine distinction, and every so often they'll say no. And you can allow them just to place it underneath in the column 5, because when we put it into the analysis, really it is just a ranking with ties. So instead of having 2 tied ranks, we've got 3, and it can. I mean, it could cope with a rectangular distribution. It doesn't really matter, but it seems to help people, and they seem to sort quite naturally in that way. I'd say the only exception for me was trying to Q-sort with other researchers who were fighting the method. So people kind of refusing, and but mostly it's fine. It seems to work fine. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Sterling. We've got a question from Veronica online. I'll read it aloud. Hi, have there been any investigations into education level required / capacity to perform a Q-sort? We ran into some challenges with some participants who got overwhelmed or confused in process. We performed 64 statement sort related to diabetes, social and cultural factors with a range of SES backgrounds, etc. of patients.
Oh, good. That's a good question. And I think, like any research method, we have to think about whether or not what we're producing is something that people can cope with. So I suppose there's a kind of a short answer to the question, which is around thinking about the reading age or the reading complexity of the statements, the length of the statements and the number of statements, and piloting it. But then I think, depending on the participant group, you might want to think more radically about something that was even more simplified. So I've seen Q-sorts where they were single words. So that may not be appropriate in every context, but in some it might still give you some useful information, and equally pictures. So I think the literature I would have a look at, and I can follow this up by email if that's helpful, is some people have done some Q studies with children and some Q studies with people with early cognitive decline, so the early stages of dementia. And they've thought very, very hard about whether or not people can cope with what they're doing. But sometimes it's exactly where you look to when an interview is too complex. So I think, yeah, there's probably several answers and several places to look for that, but it's a really good point.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for the question, Veronica. It's very generous of Rachel to offer to be available by email, so you might be in touch with her. You've got her email address there. Might be in touch with her directly if you've got further questions. Are there other questions from in the room?
I have a follow-up question to Veronica's question. So how can you do cross-cultural Q studies? So if you want to do the same question with children or different people from different languages or different cultures, and you might have to adopt different strategies, is it possible to do a similar study and interpret it across culture and across age and across different levels of ability? Or
Sure. I mean, I can answer that in relation to a kind of international or cross-country study that we did in Europe, where we had 10 different countries involved. And the decision that you've to make, I suppose, early on is whether or not there is a common concourse. So that idea that there is a debate or there is discussion around this, and it is going on in all of these places. And in our case, it was about healthcare priority setting, and we were relatively comfortable that there was some discussion in all of those countries around that topic. And then the next question you need to ask is whether or not you want to use the same Q set translated, or whether or not you want to develop an individual Q set for each context. The obvious advantage of the common Q set is that you can still use the maths. So we went with that. So we had, you know, a Polish, a Danish, an English set, a French set, and so on. And we were careful about back translation. Hopefully all these statements mean the same thing. And then we could say, well, this Danish factor is correlated like this with this UK factor. So there was strength in doing that, and the limitations are around is translating it okay. There are other examples of European studies where they've got independent sets of statements for each country. You find 10 country solutions, and then you have to compare them in a narrative, really. But I think the first question is the concourse there? Yeah. So if it isn't an older person's concourse, if it's not a debate for that community, then it's not, it doesn't seem right, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Lynn. Any further questions from WebExers? I see none. We've just got about a minute left. Anything else in the room? All right. Well, it sounds like oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just wondering in terms, say, like in terms of the qualitative and quantitative, in terms of like, do people would they combine this into some kind of like a quantitative model in terms of trying to explain decision making or something? Is that what people do, or can they do that? Say they were doing something with like preference solicitation, and you wanted them to try and understand their underlying preferences. Can you?
So what you might do is, say you've got some information from a Q study that tells me that you're, you know, a pure and high load on factor A. So you think like that. You could use that as an explanatory variable in the same way you might use all sorts of other socio-demographic variables, and see whether or not that helps to explain something else like choice better or not as powerfully as your age or your gender or whatever else. So yeah, I think you could. Few people have though, but I think you could, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everyone in the room, for the questions. Thank you, Rachel, so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Thank you, Sterling, for arranging Rachel's participation today. Greatly appreciated. And thank you, everyone who has participated, both in real time and those who are tuning in after the fact. So, again, many thanks from the BC Support Unit for your time today, Rachel. We really appreciated your presentation.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.